While preparing this lecture, I was reminded of how my former professor, the respected Finnish philosopher of religion and ethicist Tage Kurtén, how he used to criticize positivism. He used to ask, if one day we managed to explain everything about the world and life through science to its smallest elements, how would that help us to live good lives? By this, he meant that science can offer us valuable perspectives on the world and our lives, but this did not mean that science in its positivist forms could provide answers to everything. We also needed access to other forms of knowledge that allowed us to determine how a good life could be understood. My professor was influenced by the influential philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, especially his later works. In the posthumously published Philosophische Untersuchungen, Wittgenstein pointed a direction for his contemporary philosophy away from currents of thought that reduced knowledge to the acquisition of universal epistemological foundations, including positivism. According to Wittgenstein, what we say and believe must be understood in relation to the context in which we are involved, what Wittgenstein described as language games. As he explained, each context had its own rules that were only reasonable within that context. To claim that God is good in a scientific context influenced by positivism would thus be strange, perhaps even absurd. But in a Christian, Muslim, or other religious community within those kind of communities, such a claim might be natural and even important. According to Wittgenstein, language that was thus context-bound and should therefore be understood according to the rules of the language used. That is, language is made meaningful because those who, so to speak, play with it do so according to certain rules. The French philosopher and literary scholar Francois Libertad took up Wittgenstein's thinking. He distinguished between two different forms of knowledge. The first he described as scientific knowledge that methodologically tries to describe the world, thus a positivist form of knowledge. Libertad is critical of this notion of knowledge as exclusive to truth, as an exclusive way of finding out what is true, and therefore argues that it's not the only possible form of knowledge. He wrote, "Scientific knowledge does not represent the totality of knowledge. It has always existed in addition to and in competition and conflict with other kinds of knowledge." Libertad describes the alternative form of knowledge as narrative knowledge. So in short, Libertad argues that we all live in social groupings that have a certain language that we use. This language includes not only verbal communication, but also the practices, morals, and stories we share. It is therefore language in a fairly broad sense, encompassing a wide range of our human expressions. But all language have in common that they communicate something about the culture to which we belong. This is therefore the narrative knowledge that we have, and it also knowledge that is different from scientific positivist knowledge. Because it is tied to our cultural expressions, it is also a type of knowledge that is different from one group to another, and it is not possible to determine which of these groups has a better narrative knowledge than the other, as it is bound to that specific context. Here it is important to emphasize that neither Wittgenstein, Libertad, nor my professor felt that scientific knowledge was bad. None of them were relativists and generally did not question the knowledge scientific research produced. What they did point out, however, was that knowledge came in many forms. A philosophical school of thought that developed more or less independently of an European tradition, but in a similar way, was American pragmatism. We turn to American pragmatism in the next video. It is also interesting for our purposes because it directly addresses the importance of education.